just dawned on me based on my own experiences, including recent ones, that, you know, you really need to be protected if you have a shot of saying what you really think is true, particularly in the coming 12 months, which is, I mean, it's the most intense period, and not just in this country, but around the world. I mean, lots of places are changing dramatically. The whole world is reshuffling, and there's going to be a lot of pressure to shut people down because the information war is the real war, of course. Words are more powerful in the end than, you know, anything Raytheon sells, and more enduring. So they're going to try and stop people from noting obvious truths about what's happening, and if you want to be one of the few who is able to say what he thinks, you cannot be dependent on advertisers or big companies. You just can't. And that means you have to set up some kind of system that pays for a fortress of reporters and that is, you know, immune to advertiser pressure. You know, say my prayers every morning, take a sauna, try to spend time with my wife and dogs and kids. You know, I mean, those are things that you kind of can't prepare yourself for ahead of time. You know, have a ready pool of cash for legal defense, of course, but really it's inside you. Are you the sort of person who's going to get beaten down and give up? And so you need to keep yourself strong inside, not to over dramatize, but I do think a lot is at stake. And you're absolutely right that the government is one of the driving forces behind censorship, and it's always through proxies and cutouts. That's what happened to Alex Jones. I mean, the FBI was all over that, you know, that suit, that civil suit against him that resulted in the $1 billion judgment that for a while almost put him out of business. I mean, that didn't happen in a vacuum, sorry. And so, yeah, they have a lot of ways of doing it, and doubtless they'll try. But of course, I mean, but the other thing is, I've already been through some of that, or quite a bit of it actually, and so I'm certainly not intimidated. Maybe they'll succeed, but it's not going to stop me from talking. I mean, if it gets to the point where I'm like, you know, standing downtown with a bullhorn, okay, that's where we are. But I think we have an obligation to say what we think is true. I personally have a burning need to do that. I can't respect myself if I don't, and so I'm not going to stop. But God knows what's going to happen in the next year. Honestly, I mean, you both can feel it. Every person who's paying any attention at all can feel it. There are all these unresolvable conflicts that are coming to a head in the same year.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's a huge concern for me. Yeah. I could not imagine that certain things could possibly be true. And I felt like I was more open-minded than most 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16. And there was a lot going on. And I'm revisiting some of those stories from that time and thinking, wait a second, the wackos, or the people I thought were wackos, were really onto something. And maybe not the whole story, but there's definitely something there. And I'll just give you one example, which is and I was writing about it this morning in a piece that we're doing on Julian Assange, who we visited in prison. You know, the emails from the DNC in 2016 that showed that the Hillary campaign had rigged the primary against Bernie Sanders, who had popular support, grassroots support. She did not. She was fully AstroTurf corporate candidate. And they told us that Russia stole those emails. Well, that's not true. And it was kind of obvious at the time that it wasn't true. Bill Binney did a big piece on this in The Nation. Like, as a tech matter, that couldn't have happened. So someone from inside the building leaked those to WikiLeaks, and Assange has effectively said the same thing. So, like, what is that? So there's all this energy invested in convincing the rest of us that Russia did it, that it did not come from within the DNC, and just shut up. You're crazy. You're a conspiracy nut. And they were lying. So what does that mean? Why were they lying? What were they hiding? Something. And so they're telling you that to divert your attention from the wars, which I actually have been passionately against since I went to Iraq in 2003, but not enough, I agree with you, but also from the financial crimes. So you can, like, invent a fake cryptocurrency and steal, you know, billions of dollars from 1 million separate individual investors and give some to your parents to buy beachfront property in the Bahamas. And it's not that big a story. Well, in my view, that's a really big story. That's a huge story. Like, what? The Federal Reserve prints all this money, trillions of dollars. They have a permanent emergency for over 10 years. 0 interest rates. Where does all that money go? So the Fed prints the money. What happens then? Well, it goes to a select number of banks, which have, you know, encoded in regulation, have a special deal where they just get rich no matter what. Well, why is that fair? And by the way, why are we taxing people double for working? You pay half the taxes if you invest as you do if you work. So are we saying investing is twice as virtuous as working? I mean, that's like an actual debate we should have, but we don't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, for one thing, in addition to all of the other sins, and by the way, running cover for the most powerful people in your society and pretending you're not doing it, that is a sin, just to be clear. But in addition to that, on a non-moral level, just as a viewer, it's very boring to be, and it's boring for a specific reason. So if I have a mission in what I'm telling you, if the whole point of my telling you this is to convince you of something specific, right? If it's the definition of propaganda, I have to keep repeating it endlessly. I can't sort of veer off into something I find interesting, like how'd they build the pyramids? I'm probably not going to get into that because my job is to convince you that Zelensky is Churchill, and so that's all I'm going to talk about, or that, you know, whatever it is, whatever the lie is. And so they wind up repeating like the same four stories forever. You know, January 6th was a white supremacist insurrection. Okay, you know, okay, I disagree, I don't think you're right, but if you tell me that every single day for 3 years, not only does your propaganda fail, with me anyway, because I'm like, why are they telling me this again? But you also drive me off because you're boring me to death. Like, I want to hear something else. I want to hear something interesting. I want curious people gathering my news. Curiosity is the key to the news business. What's happening now, last thing I'll say, is the promise of the internet originally. The promise originally was, you know, everyone gets a voice, you get to hear all kinds of perspectives. That kind of died for a while. We're hearing one perspective, and it reached its peak when they took Parler off the internet. And now I really think it's reemerging because that other stuff is just, its era has passed. They've known clearly, I mean, this is, I think, established, and I feel comfortable saying this as fact. The U.S. government, I mean, these are real, whatever they are. They're not human. And the government has known that for a long time, possibly going back to the 1930s at least. And of course, there's tons of evidence in the written record, in the physical record, in paintings, and in literature, that people have been seeing and interacting with these things for a long time. So we know that. But the justification one often hears is, well, the government, various presidents who have been read in, not all have been, haven't wanted to disclose this because it would scare people. And I've always thought that's you know, you're hiding a crime, which they are, by the way, in my opinion. But I do think there's a sense in which that's not totally crazy. Like, there is some stuff, if it's true, and I'm kind of thinking it may be true, that's so radical that, yeah, well, as we both said, we, you know, don't want to tell the people we love most about it because, like, why would you, you know, disturb someone like that? So I kind of get that. I hate to admit it. I'm not arguing for hiding things. I believe in the truth and I believe in disclosure, but I understand the impulse. Like, holy smokes, this is heavy. I mean, it's opaque. It's like looking through a shower curtain. You can only see outlines. And I'm not bragging, but one of my few skills is I've called most races pretty accurately because they're pretty obvious. The outlines are obvious years in advance, and certainly a year out, they're very obvious. In this case, it seems irresolvable. So you have, you know, basically every power center in the country will do anything to prevent Trump from winning, anything. I mean, that's the most important thing to them, is to keep Trump from becoming president again. Now, why is that? Is a whole separate and very interesting conversation, but that's just a fact, okay? And these are the same people who are lecturing us about democracy. We're saving democracy. Democracy dies in darkness. Democracy is the most important thing. You heard that creepy defense contractor say what we're really doing is preserving democracy. We're not just like selling weapons. We're preserving democracy, right. Which was a nauseating clip, and I hope on some level he's punished for that. But anyway. So, but then at the same time, you have Trump like is leading the race in every nonpartisan, or all the liberal polls are showing him leading the race, beating Joe Biden in the battleground states. So, like, they can't let him win, but if they don't let him win, then it's just super obvious that all this democracy stuff was fraudulent, and that it's not a democracy, it's an oligarchy run by the richest people, that Bernie Sanders, back when he was a free man, was telling the truth. And so at that point, like, the veil's off. We can't pretend anymore. Like, when they killed Kennedy, which they did, they could kind of pretend like everything's fine. But after this election, there's no pretending everything's fine. Everyone will know. And it is a little bit like you get kidnapped, you get thrown in the back of the car, and all of a sudden the kidnapper turns around and lowers his mask and you see his face. And that's not a good thing. Because once you see his face, he has to kill you. Because you know who he is. He can't let you go then, okay? So you sort of want the kidnapper to keep his mask on because the pretense allows him the freedom to let you go in the end, to pretend everything's fine. But they've showed us who they are with such unmistakable clarity that I kind of don't know how we get along after this election unless they decelerate and just do what they should do, which is like, look, we don't like Trump, here's why. We don't think he's good for the country, here's why. We think Joe Biden's great, here's why. America, make your choice. But I don't think they are going to do that. They're morally obligated to do that, but they won't. And it's incumbent on them to do that. Stop charging them with crimes that your own people skate on. Like, that's the truth. Stop that. Just let the election happen. Let's have a free and fair election for the first time in a while since 2016. And if they allow that to happen, I think the country would get better. And then if Trump is a crappy president, okay, we survived it the first time. He's not very radical, actually. He's pretty moderate. We'll be fine. But I think they're too hysterical to allow that to happen. And so I'm very worried about it.
A 50-minute flight on a private jet can emit as much carbon as the average person's car does over an entire year. 50 minutes. It's not really about carbon emissions, is it? It's about hurting people, specific people. They think there are too many people. Environmentalism is supposed to be about protecting the environment, and most people are completely in favor of that. But the environmental movement of today has nothing to do with protecting the environment. They're destroying the environment, killing the California condor with their wind projects and whales, and basically wrecking Africa with all the elements needed for their new battery revolution. There are still people in this country, for example, who seem to believe that the so-called climate agenda is actually about the climate or about the environment of the earth or something, and not a coordinated effort by the government of China to hobble the US and the West and take its place as the leader of the world, which of course is exactly what's going on. There is the climate change agenda. And the climate change agenda is the single most ambitious effort to remake human civilization in all recorded history. And it's coming. In fact, it's already in progress. The only reason that millions and millions of Americans aren't protesting in the streets tonight over this effort to completely overturn their lives. And you should also remember that the United Nations has been saying pretty much the same thing since at least 1989. That's the year that the Associated Press reported that, and we're quoting, a senior UN environmental official says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. That was 34 years ago. Happy to report we're still here. So has the science changed? Well, apparently it has. Not that anyone will acknowledge that. If you read it closely, if you took a look at the UN's entire report, and actually we spent the day doing that, there are big differences in how they plan to solve global warming. This time, the plan is much more explicit. Make the West, the United States primarily, but also Western Europe, blow up its own economy, while China, the fastest growing economy in the world, doesn't have to do anything. China is currently building, well, 2 new coal plants every week. Every week. Not good at math, but that's like 104 a year? That's a lot of coal plants. How many are we building a week? 0. Pretty weird for a country committed to fighting climate change. Well, the report says that compared to Eastern Asia, North American countries have a 33% greater obligation. How do you measure obligation? Is there a scientific scale for that? But a greater obligation, 33% more, to accelerate spending on, quote, mitigation investment flows to, quote, limit global warming. Okay, the West has that obligation. Now, if you were to go by like real numbers, you might notice that China's carbon emissions today are more than double our carbon emissions here in the United States. So we're spewing less carbon, they're spewing a lot more carbon, but we have to spend more because we have a moral obligation, because why? That's not explained. But later in the report, the United Nations does say this, quote, actions that prioritize equity, climate justice, social justice, and inclusion lead to more sustainable outcomes, co-benefits, reduce trade-offs, support transformative change, and advance climate-resilient development. Adaptation responses are immediately needed to reduce rising climate risks, especially for the most vulnerable. Equity, inclusion, and just transitions are key to progress on adaptation and deep societal ambitions for accelerated migration. That's science. Try not to use a swear word on TV, but I think we know what that is. It's BS. Turns out that globally accepted goal originated in a newspaper advertisement and a draft paper that was not even peer-reviewed. Now, it's in the Paris Climate Agreement. That's the power of marketing. But what's the point, of course? What's the point of the marketing? It's to destroy one civilization to be supplanted by the next civilization. Unfortunately, we're the one being destroyed, or that is destroying itself. And no one at the UN, by the way, cares about the data, where it came from, because the real goal has nothing to do with the environment. Of course, duh! Look at the pollution! If you cared about the environment, this is a tough time to live. But ever since Julian Huxley took over UNESCO in the 1940s, pushing Malthusianism, the idea that the world's overpopulated has been the dominant way of thinking for the people in charge, except with respect to their own families, they have as many kids as they want, but you're not allowed to. This was really a milestone in modern Christian theology. Climate, declared Father Buttigieg, is a moral issue, not a meteorological matter, not even a policy topic. It's a moral issue. Climate is a question that bears directly on the fate of your immortal soul. When you mistreat the climate, you risk damnation. Insomuch as you have done to the least of these, you have done it to the climate. Big change. You thought it was about the science. Actually, it's about morality. Okay, Reverend Pete, so you set the terms here. So how's your climate record? That seems like a fair question, given that you've just told us that we will go to hell for our carbon emissions. So let's see how you're doing. The real crime here is against the climate. It's a sin, it's a moral transgression, because none of these planes that Pete Buttigieg was jetting around on were solar powered. Not a single one ran on a windmill or recycled French fry oil. They were all fossil fueled, all of them. And there is likely no mode of transportation in the history of machines that emits more carbon than private air travel. That would include long trips across India on coal-fired locomotives. Private jet travel stands alone. Private jets emit an average of 2 tons of carbon dioxide in an hour, per hour. For perspective, that's 14 times more carbon emissions per passenger than the JetBlue flight you're on, or any other commercial flight. So you might as well start a tire fire to heat your house. That would be better for the atmosphere than what Pete Buttigieg is doing. Traveling by private jet is literally the last thing that Father Pete should ever do. But we shouldn't be surprised that he's doing it. This year alone, to pick but one among many examples, Steven Spielberg, who said he's terrified of climate change, emitted over 4,400 metric tons of carbon from private jets. How much is that? That's 600 times more emissions than the average person emits in a year. Another climate activist, Taylor Swift, nearly doubled Steven Spielberg's total. 8,000 metric tons of CO2 in a year. All of them destroying the planet, rising the seas, an offense against Mother Earth. But it's not okay, not if you claim to believe in climate change. A 50-minute flight on a private jet can emit as much carbon as the average person's car does over an entire year. 50 minutes. So imagine what a flight from DC to LAX does, or more likely from Hamptons to Aspen. And then imagine thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of these flights, all carrying people who claim they believe that climate change is, quote, existential. It's not a mistake, it's intentional, it's a statement, and it's quite a statement if you think about it. If you're yapping about carbon emissions and climate and then flying private, what you're really doing is hoisting a screaming middle finger to the country, to the plebes below in their SUVs, which you say you plan to ban. And not just in this country, we've got it easy. The economies of entire nations around the world are being destroyed right now in the name of fighting climate change at the behest of people who fly private. So people are going hungry and freezing to death around the world so that Pete Buttigieg and his friends won't have to walk through the magnetometer at the TSA checkpoint.
Well, I think the best example of that's probably both Sri Lanka and Germany. I mean, Sri Lanka is an absolute wasteland at the moment as a direct consequence of idiot, hypothetically environmentalist policies. And then in Germany, energy is much more expensive than it was. It's much more unreliable than it was. The Germans are dangerously dependent on dictators and the Russians. And that's all a consequence of hypothetical environmentalist policies. So even by the standards laid down by the environmentalists themselves, the policies that were put in place that were pro-environmental are failing. But there's something that's even deeper lying underneath the surface. So Tucker, it's become pretty clear recently, as a consequence of converging evidence from a lot of different disciplines, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and literary criticism, odd bedfellows, by the way, and there's more scientific and humanities endeavors involved in this convergence than those, that the structure through which we see the world is essentially a narrative, is a story.
Yes.
And so, and in fact, I asked the world's greatest neuroscientist about a month ago on my podcast, Carl Friston, if even our object perceptions were micro stories, and he said that that was clearly the case, and he's speaking as a scientist, by the way. And so that begs a question: if we see the world through a story, what is that story, and what should it be, and what are the fundamental elements that the story has to contain? And so the environmentalists offer us a story to live by, and it's a pseudo-religious story, and it essentially elevates the biosphere, the Earth, Gaia, the Earth goddess, let's say, to the status of primary deity, and characterizes her as sort of a waif-like, innocent victim, easily taken advantage of and fragile. It casts the entire human endeavor on the social front as a raping and pillaging patriarchal monster only interested in power. And it casts the individual as like a devouring mouth riding on the back of that giant, essentially. I don't think anybody with any sense ever debates that. And it's also clearly the case that if we were careful with nuclear power, and we could be, because we've been building nuclear plants for a long time, that we could be providing extremely low-cost energy to people, especially poor people throughout the world. But we're not going to do that. In fact, we have an anti-energy policy in place, especially in any places that are ruled essentially by the left. And the consequence of that is, well, I just saw today, UNICEF just released a report showing that there's been a 25% increase in the last year and a half in the number of women and children that are starving around the world. It's a direct consequence of the increase in energy prices, which are in themselves a direct consequence of anti-industrial policies put in place by hypothetically well-meaning, deluded, pseudo-religious environmental worshippers of the apocalypse. It's an appalling situation, and it's likely to get worse, I would say, before it gets better.
And you know who else isn't? BlackRock. The ESG score that you keep hearing about? Your flights on private planes have no effect on an ESG score. Really? The E is for environment. But BlackRock doesn't say a word. Could it be that the climate movement isn't really about the climate or about the environment? Could it be that the climate movement is really about creating a permanent caste system where the people at the top of society, the Brahmins, can do literally whatever they want, can violate with impunity the standards they impose on others while endlessly lecturing and oppressing the population that supposedly runs the country, but of course actually doesn't? Could it be? Oh, it's possible. We called Pete Buttigieg's office today and asked how you can justify flying private as the earth warms and the seas rise. How are you not a climate criminal? Speak slowly so we can understand. Of course, they didn't explain. But the rest of us should impose this as a litmus test going forward. No one who seeks to impose carbon rationing on another human being should ever be allowed to step within 100 yards of a private aircraft. Period. Anyone who claims to be serious about fighting climate change should demand tomorrow morning a federal law against private air travel. Make it illegal. It's that simple. Then go ahead and fly commercial with everyone else or stay home. What's the argument against that? Well, here's what you do know. Anyone who lectures you about climate and opposes banning private air travel is a total fraud and should be ignored. A Harvard historian, Naomi Oreskes, wrote an op-ed in Scientific American entitled 8 Billion People in the World is a Crisis, Not an Achievement. Well, if you're one of those 8 billion, that seems like hostility. If some chick is writing a piece in a science magazine about how your existence is bad, that might make you nervous, right? It should. And it may explain why these people oppose nuclear energy, which seems like a solution, but they're against that too. So it's not really about carbon emissions, is it? It's about hurting people, specific people. They think there are too many people. And this view is very widespread. It's why the leaders of the Democratic Party are always in your face telling you to get an abortion. Hurry up and get an abortion. It'll help the GDP. It doesn't hurt, of course, that getting rid of fossil fuels would mean a lot of Democratic Party leaders will get a lot richer. Their donors certainly will, the ones in the renewable industry. It also means a ton of money for people with no skills at all, like Jen Granholm, who's now the energy secretary, who owned stock in these green energy companies while she was in office. It's also corrupt. It's unbelievable. And they're in your face. There's no such thing as climate alarmism. Shut up and accept it. In this country, we have more firearms in civilian hands than we have civilian hands. Imagine a system where the person who's been charged is no longer allowed to defend himself. But if you're talking about rights, you at some point want to identify the most basic human right of all. What is that? Well, of course, it's the right of self-defense. That's the essential right upon which all other rights depend. If you can't defend yourself, you can't defend your family and your property, you don't have any rights at all. You're a slave by definition. So you may be wondering, in this moment of creeping authoritarianism, how is the right to self-defense doing in our country? Self-defense, the cornerstone of all freedoms, without which you cannot be free, you are owned. Self-defense is becoming illegal, in effect, in a lot of places. And not just in very liberal places, like New York City, even in states with some of the strongest self-defense laws on the books. Arizona, for example, allows residents to shoot trespassers on their property. The fact that so many Americans have a firearm within reach but never commit violence tells you that guns are not the problem. Most people in this country can be trusted with an AR-15, just as we can be trusted with cars and light aircraft and electricity and baseball bats and insecticide and chainsaws and pruning shears and countless other objects that could easily double as weapons. So now this very same system, the system that imprisoned Jose Alba and chained Musa Diarra to his hospital bed, this Soros-inspired and backed system is putting Joe Biden's main political opponent in the upcoming presidential race on trial for a crime that's not actually a crime. This is the political tyranny part of anarcho-tyranny. At about 5 a.m. on Saturday morning in Manhattan, a parking garage attendant called Musa Diarra noticed a man peering into parked cars looking for things to steal. Now, that's a familiar scene in New York City. Alvin Bragg, who is the local Soros-funded DA, has decided that prosecuting car burglaries is a form of white supremacy. As a result, not surprisingly, car burglaries have risen quite a bit. Musa Diarra, the attendant, is not white, but apparently he's sick of watching other people get robbed, so he told the man to get out, leave the garage. In response, the man pulled out a handgun and fired 4 times. He hit Diarra in the head and the stomach. It was a nightmare. But somehow, Musa Diarra had the presence of mind to wrestle the gun from the man and then fire back before the man could shoot him or anyone else. By the time police arrived, both men were lying on the sidewalk bleeding. Now, what do you think happened next? In a sane, self-respecting society, Musa Diarra would have received a medal, if not a ticker tape parade. But in the city of New York, he was arrested and charged with attempted murder and illegal possession of a gun, the same gun that had been used to shoot him. Diarra woke up in Bellevue Hospital shackled to his bed. The New York Post ran this picture. It's of him sobbing. "I got bullets in me and I'm chained to a hospital bed," he said, "but I didn't do anything wrong." You can imagine his confusion. This was not the country he expected. And in fact, Musa Diarra is exactly the kind of person you want more of in your country. He's 57 years old and he's still working harder than most young people do. The man who shot him, by contrast, does not have a history of going to work every day. His name is Charles Rody. We checked. He's got a rap sheet of nearly a dozen serious crimes that go back more than 20 years. And yet, as of Saturday at 5 a.m., he was not in jail. He was walking around New York with a gun looking for more things to steal. So for our existing legal system, this appears to be a point of no return. And you would think the media would point that out, even if they support it. This is a big change from the way the country has run for hundreds of years. But no, because they're too dumb, too shallow, and above all, too self-interested. So Trump's upcoming arraignment tomorrow isn't a turning point in our country's legal system. It's yet another chance to follow Trump around in the hope that ratings will return. Well, it is a big deal, actually. It's a very, very big deal. But the guardrails are gone. No one in the media seems to be pointing out that this is a huge change in our entire legal system. And no one in the Democratic Party in Washington, even those who are a little bit concerned about where this might be heading, dares say anything at all because Alvin Bragg is, of course, a holy person and no one wants to speak out against the crowd on Twitter. So this is all happening in slow motion, and of course we're getting the dumbest possible lectures, as always, from cable news. We've learned not to put everything at 11. We're not making everything the biggest deal. It's hilarious. And of course, they can't wait to make it the biggest deal on the shallowest possible level, and the reason is economic. Since Trump left office, CNN has lost more than 60% of its viewers. They're desperately trying to sell the channel because, it's tanking. So they have every incentive to sensationalize anything that Trump does, no matter what happens to the country in the process. So here you have a Soros-funded DA perp-walking a former president. What does this mean? What could Trump possibly be guilty of? They don't even tell you. All they tell their eager but small audience is the walls are closing in on career criminal Donald Trump. They're going to turn Trump's motorcade into OJ's Bronco because otherwise they're going to be out of a job because nobody watches them anymore. Imagine a system where the person who's been charged is no longer allowed to defend himself. Oh, are you seeing the connection here? Like the parking garage attendant who was shot by a criminal, he gets arrested. Like Jose Alba, who tried to save his own life from a lunatic in his bodega, he gets arrested. The people who are the victims of the tyranny don't get to speak. CNN speaks for them. Imagine that. There are multiple reports tonight that Alvin Bragg's office will seek a gag order when Trump is arraigned. Now, that would prevent Trump, on pain of going to prison, from talking about his case in public. But CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post, all the completely filthy, corrupt liars in the media, handmaidens to power, they'll be able to say whatever they want. And it's possible you've heard an advocate for gun control say that in this country we have more firearms in civilian hands than we have civilian hands. And that is true, actually. The total American population is about 332 million people, and collectively they own more than 400 million firearms. About half of all U.S. households have at least one gun at home, and many have much more than that. Plus, they have ammo, billions and billions of rounds of it. Those are all real numbers, but they are hardly an argument for gun control. They're an argument, in fact, against it. Ask yourself, what would it require to confiscate all those guns and all that ammunition and turn the United States into a disarmed nation like Turkmenistan or North Korea? Well, it would take a police state, and it would end in civil war. No sane person wants either one of those things, but thankfully, we don't need them. In the late 19th century, researchers finally decided that infection is spread by germs, and as a result of that conclusion, surgeons are now required to wash their hands before they cut you open. Everybody agrees that this is progress. But what if we had refused to learn how infection is spread? What if we just didn't want to know? Well, appendectomies would still be fatal, and we would be a backward, ridiculous, uncaring people. It's impossible even to imagine that. And yet, on the question of violent crime, of murder, it's very easy to imagine that because it's happening. Our leaders are determined not to know why people shoot each other, and they don't want us to know either. They're adamant that we do not ask questions about motive. It seems, for example, like an awful lot of mass shooters have taken prescription psychiatric drugs in the days before they opened fire and killed others. Have you noticed that? Maybe you have noticed that. Good luck saying it in public. You'll be shouted down immediately by someone with an advanced degree. How dare you criticize Big Pharma? What are you, a conspiracy nut? No, actually you're not. You're someone who cares about cause and effect. You're a rational person. The only conspiracy here is the one designed to prevent you from figuring out why mass shootings keep happening. Consider the killings that took place on Monday in Nashville. The killer was a 28-year-old female transgenderist who shot her way into a Christian elementary school and murdered 3 9-year-olds and 3 adults. Why did she do that? In a rational country, that is the very first question we would ask. In our country, it's the last question. In fact, often it's never asked at all. On those rare occasions when somebody finally manages to wonder out loud about motive, our leaders immediately start lying, which should tell you a lot.